Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? So maybe at the back, can you hear me? Okay, perfect. So last week we started talking about micronutrients, and we had a guest speaker who covered vitamins. And so from the vitamins, he looked at the fat-soluble vitamins, and he also looked at water-soluble vitamins. And so if you haven't had a chance to listen to that, please make sure you take a look at that if you were not in class. What we want to do this week is to move on to talk about minerals, which also belongs in the group of micronutrients. And so this week's module will look at minerals, and we will divide minerals into two sections. So the first section will talk about sodium and potassium. And that's just important because high blood pressure, also an important risk factor for cardiovascular disease, is of concern in the Canadian population. So we'll spend some time just talking about sodium and potassium and how they do influence development of high blood pressure. And then we'll move on to section 2, where we'll talk about some major minerals, okay, with most of the discussion being around calcium and bone health as well. And so once we are done, I do have a crossword attached. I don't know if you can see it on Kirkus under week 12. We will take a look at that to try to see if we understand some of the things we've talked about so far. Okay. So minerals are inorganic compounds. I feel like the sound is a bit off. Can you hear me? Yeah? Or it was just the trains? Okay. So minerals are inorganic compounds that are needed by the body in small amounts. And the minerals that we will be discussing are divided into two categories. And these are ones that are required in the body in amounts greater than 100 milligrams. So when we're looking at minerals, if they are required in amounts greater than 100 milligrams, then they are referred to as major minerals. What we will discuss, and that is what we are discussing this week. Next week, we'll be looking at trace minerals, or what sometimes is referred to as minor minerals or minor elements. And these are required in smaller amounts, so less than 100 milligrams, which, as I said, we'll be talking about next week. So there are supporting documents included with the modules, and these supporting documents are also shown here. And so for the major minerals, we'll be looking at sodium, potassium. We'll talk a bit more about calcium, and then mention phosphorus and magnesium. And then next week, we look at the trace minerals, or the minor minerals: iodine, iron, zinc, copper, magnesium, and chromium. And so please note that there are supporting documents to help with covering this topic, in addition to the textbook readings that have been given. So let's begin our discussion with sodium, potassium, and hypertension or high blood pressure. So sodium and potassium, they are essential to cell function, as they play an important role in fluid balance in the body. And so in this diagram, we see potassium. Potassium is shown in purple, and this is typically found inside the cell. We also see sodium. Sodium is shown in red, and it's typically found outside the cells, or where we call the extracellular spaces. So typically, there is more sodium in the extracellular spaces, and then you will find more potassium in the intracellular spaces. So the sodium and potassium move against their concentration gradients. And they do this with the help of what we call the sodium-potassium ATPase pump. And that is shown in blue. So this will be the structure here. You can think of this ATPase, the sodium-potassium ATPase, as a cell membrane protein that is able to help maintain the gradient of a higher concentration of sodium outside the cell and a higher concentration of potassium inside the cell. Okay, so intracellularly, we want a higher concentration of potassium, and extracellularly, a higher concentration of sodium. So the sustained concentration gradient is very important for some physiological processes, in many organs, and it has an ongoing role in stabilizing the resting membrane potential of the cell. So when you think about how the cell membrane functions, this concentration gradient is important. Okay. And it helps also in regulating the volume of the cell. So one thing to keep in mind here is that when we're looking at the sodium potassium ATPase, it does require ATP in being able to maintain this balance. And so most natural or whole foods contain high amounts of potassium and low amounts of sodium naturally, which from the point of controlling blood pressure or hypertension is a favorable ratio between the two minerals. However, we see that when food is highly processed, such as the examples shown here, and so just moving to the figure here for a second, here we have less processed or minimally processed foods. So for example, oatmeal, just using oatmeal as an example. And then we see more processed products. So we can see Cheerios here being more processed. And so you have the pink bars showing sodium levels, and then the blue bars are showing you potassium levels in milligrams, as we can see. And so by just, when we look at oatmeal, a 250 ml portion, we can see the differences in how much potassium is in the food. And once it's much more processed, we can see that the sodium levels are much higher than what we see for potassium. And that remains true when you're looking at other products as well, whether you're looking at baked potatoes versus French fries, right? So the more, it looks like the more highly processed foods are, then you do have the potassium levels coming down. And then as processing is going on, more sodium is introduced into the product. So salt is added to these processed foods because, first of all, salt makes the food taste better. But salt also has an important role in preserving the food, right? And also, when we think about the polarity of salt, it helps to hold water in the food, and it helps to improve the texture of the food as well. Salt is an important humectant, making sure that water in the food is bound so that it's not available for microbial growth. And so because of all these properties of salt, more salt is put in food as a way of extending the shelf life of the food. And so when you have a minute, you can look at some of the differences that you see between like just pork roasted and ham roasted and look at the differences in how much sodium is introduced as a preservative method. So back in the earlier weeks of this course, when we talked about DRIs, we focused on some types of DRIs such as EAR. So by now we should all know what EARs are, RDAs are, ULs, the upper tolerable intake levels. And we talked about AMDRs because you've used them in your assignments as well. Okay. So it was briefly mentioned at that time that there was an additional DRI that we were not going to discuss, but leave into the end when we talk about micronutrients. And this is what is called the chronic disease risk reduction intake level, or what is most commonly called CDRR. So this is a new dietary reference intake that was just recently established, and we only have a CDRR for sodium. So as you gather from the name, it's intended to represent an intake that helps to reduce the risk of chronic diseases. Okay. So for example, when we are determining DRI, it might involve, for example, a review of scientific literature that looks at the relationship between a nutrient and some chronic disease. And especially we're focusing on RCTs because we can establish causal links with that. So very often the quantitative evidence that we get from these RCTs, or the numbers that we're getting from these RCTs, will then be translated into a recommended intake when there's enough suitable data available. A CDRR is a bit different. So a CDRR is determined differently depending on whether the nutrient, first of all, increases disease risk or whether it decreases disease risk. So first of all, if a nutrient reduces the risk of a disease with increased intake, then the scientific literature is reviewed to determine whether an intake that is linked to a meaningful reduction in the disease can be established. On the other hand, if the nutrient increases the risk of disease with increase in intake, then an upper limit for the nutrient will be set. And this is a nutrient level above which risk of disease will noticeably increase, right? And so for the example that we have for sodium, once a framework was determined on how we were going to establish a CDRR, they selected sodium and potassium because of their strong link to hypertension, which will be considered a chronic disease that's common in our part of the world. So they also decided to reassess adequate intakes and upper tolerable intake levels for sodium and potassium as well. And the results of the new literature reviews yielded a new AI for sodium as well as a CDRR. But with the establishment of a CDRR, it no longer became important for us to have a UL for sodium, so that was taken out. So for potassium, a new AI was established, so an adequate intake was established because there's not enough evidence, or we cannot go through a depletion-repletion to get an EAR and therefore an RDA. And so for potassium, an AI was established, but there was inadequate number of suitable RCTs for us to establish a CDRR for potassium. Yes? It will, so this is the two scenarios that we talked about in the previous slide, because once you have good potassium intake, that will be protective against hypertension. And so that will be a nutrient that reduces risk with increased intake. So if they had enough data and they could set a CDRR, they'll be looking at it as a nutrient that is protective. With increased intake, you have increased. Yes, yeah. And so based on the evidence that we had, but who knows whether we're going to have a CDRR for potassium at some point when there's enough data to support the establishment of a CDRR for potassium. Okay, so important things to remember from this slide is that we only have a CDRR for sodium, and also the review of the literature led to the establishment of a new AI. However, we do not have a UL for sodium, right? And here we had insufficient evidence to establish one for potassium. So for now, only sodium has a CDRR, and the value is 2,300 milligrams. So this is an intake that evidence shows, if exceeded on a daily basis, will noticeably increase the risk for diseases such as high blood pressure. So it specifically increases the risk of hypertension based on the studies that were reviewed. And this has been established to replace the UL. And because the old UL was also based on hypertension as well, its value has become redundant because now an upper level beyond which harm is caused has been established with a CDRR. Okay. So for nutrients that have a CDRR like sodium, it becomes unnecessary to establish a UL. A new AI for sodium was also established, and it's important to recognize that sodium is an essential nutrient. So you have to set an AI high enough to meet essential nutrient requirements, okay? So this was done by examining the results of balance studies, studies that looked at the benefits of sodium reduction, and also looked at studies that were investigating any evidence of adverse effects of very low sodium intakes. So based on this examination of the data, a new AI was set at 1,500 milligrams for all adults. And the previous AIs recommended lower intakes of sodium for older adults, but the current scientific evidence does not support the need for this additional reduction as well. So now looking at Canadians, how are Canadians doing with regards to salt intake and also potassium intake? So here we see it split up by women and men. And so women shown in blue and men with the red bars. And this is based off the 2004 and 2015 Canadian Community Health Survey. And this is just looking at the nutrition results from the intake of sodium. So as we can see here, the bars show the proportion of adults with sodium intakes above the UL. And we can see that in 2004, a significant number of Canadians, about 2/3 of women and 90% of men, are consuming extremely high amounts of sodium. In 2015, the intakes are lower, but still very high. And this is concerning because of the impact that we know that sodium has on increase in blood pressure. And this is an important risk factor for cardiovascular diseases as well. So now let us talk a little bit about potassium. So as a result of the literature review that was done in establishing whether we needed a CDRR for potassium, new adequate intakes for potassium was established. So the older adequate intake was quite a high number. It was set at 4,700 milligrams. And the new adequate intake represent the average potassium intake for a population of Americans or Canadians that have normal blood pressures. Okay. So as you can see that the numbers are quite a bit lower than the older number, and population intakes of a nutrient that has an AI are evaluated as follows. So we've talked about how to interpret AIs in the past, and so this is just highlighting how to evaluate AI intake in a population. Okay. So we do say that a population has an adequate intake if greater or equal to 50% of the population has an intake greater than the AI. Okay. And then when we're looking at if we have less than 50% of the population has an intake greater than the AI, then the population intake, we do interpret it as may or may not be adequate. So this is just a repetition of something we've heard in the past. Please note that the AI values have changed from 4,700, and then the new value is at 3,400 based on more recent studies that support normal blood pressures. Okay. So what can we say about this population? So this is again from the 2015 Canadian Community Health Survey, and it's looking at potassium intake in this population. So the population is usual intakes of potassium in females who are age 19 and over in Canada. So based on what we saw in the previous slide, what will we say is happening with this population? This is just trying to help us remember what we've talked about with regards to DRIs, and a quick refresher on how to interpret this. What do we think? Maybe think about it a second and then discuss with someone next to you before we talk about it as a group. I'm just going to go to the previous slide so you can see it. This is how to interpret it. Okay. Adequate intake if greater or equal to 50% of the population has an intake greater than the AI. And then if less than 50% has an intake greater than the AI, then we say it may or may not be adequate. Okay. So what do we think is happening here? Maybe you want to discuss with someone for a second. Yes. So we will say it may or may not be adequate because we have less than 50% falling over the AI. Okay? Right? And how do we figure that? So this is the AI value shown. Right? Okay. So the bar graphs shown here, this is yet another graph that's looking at how Canadians are doing with respect to their intake from food of sodium and potassium. So the bar graphs shown here are the results on the left. We're seeing the 2004 CCHS nutrition. And as you can see, a lot fewer than 50% of Canadian men and women consume the AI for potassium. And this is, at that time, we were still using the AI value of 4,700 milligrams. On the right is the data from the 2015 CCHS nutrition using the new AI values. And the numbers here look a little better in terms of having a higher percentage of Canadians having intakes of at least the AI. But the numbers are still not approaching 50%. So, and it is at 50% where we can confidently conclude that the population intake is adequate. So instead, when we look at these graphs, it appears that many Canadians have intakes that are less than the AI, and this probably reflects low intakes of vegetables and dairy products, which are the highest sources of potassium that we know. So we did talk about sodium and potassium at the beginning of our discussion today, how sodium and potassium have a counterbalancing effect on blood pressure. So we know that high intakes of sodium will increase blood pressure, whereas when we have high intakes of potassium, it will lower blood pressure. It's also known that foods that are high in calcium and foods that are high in magnesium also do lower blood pressure. So here's a figure that illustrates how blood pressure is regulated. And regulation of blood pressure begins when the kidneys sense a decrease in blood pressure. This causes the kidneys to now release the hormone renin. And what renin does is that it stimulates the conversion of angiotensin to angiotensin II in a multi-step process. And so angiotensin II then sets in motion a series of reactions that will lead to blood pressure being elevated again. Okay. So what are these series of reactions? So first, it will stimulate the constriction of blood vessels. And then it also acts on the adrenal gland to cause the release of the hormone aldosterone, which in turn stimulates the retention of sodium by the kidney. And with the retention of sodium comes the retention of water. And so by this process, the combination of constriction of the blood vessels and an increase in water retention, this results in an increase in blood pressure. So this system is what is called the RAS, the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. That is the RAS. Okay. And one of the hypotheses of why some people develop hypertension has to do with an overstimulation or overreaction of the system. So in response to a decline in blood pressure, the system in a healthy person is intended to restore blood pressure to normal levels. Okay. However, in someone who has an overreactive RAS, what happens is that the restoration happens and it's not able, and it keeps rising and rising without it shutting off. And so now you have an overreactive RAS system that keeps the blood pressure elevated even beyond healthy levels. Okay. So this is summarized here. So first we have a decrease in blood pressure, which triggers the kidney to release the enzyme renin. So that is what it's seen in step 1. Step 2, what you do see is renin converting angiotensin to angiotensin 1, which is then activated to angiotensin 2. And so we see that process happening here. Now you have angiotensin 2. The effect of that is that it increases blood pressure by constricting the walls of the blood vessels. And it also stimulates the release of aldosterone from the adrenal gland. And it is aldosterone that increases sodium retention or reabsorption by the kidneys, and water follows the sodium. So essentially, you have much more water, elevating the blood pressure again. Okay? So we do know that for people who have high blood pressure, the system is not able to shut off by itself once the blood pressure is elevated, and it continues increasing. Okay. So this phenomenon of an overreaction of the RAS is believed to occur in individuals that are salt sensitive. So when we talk about salt sensitivity, it refers to an increase in blood pressure that is observed when sodium intake is high. And so this flow chart that we see on the right will explain what is observed when sodium intake is high. And it illustrates the reaction to sodium intake between normal individuals and those who are salt sensitive, right? So in the presence of a high sodium intake, there's initially an increase in blood sodium levels. And with that, fluid retention, which results in an increase in blood volume and blood pressure. And so in most individuals, or in healthy individuals, the kidneys respond by excreting sodium. The water follows, and then a normal blood pressure is restored as blood volume decreases. In salt-sensitive individuals, it is believed that the sodium has an effect, a toxic effect, on the blood vessels. And this causes the blood vessels to constrict. And so with the constriction comes, a maintenance of that elevated blood pressure. Okay. Furthermore, the excretion of sodium by the kidneys is also impaired in people who are salt sensitive, right? And so this excretion that would have led to water being lost with the sodium doesn't happen optimally. And so what happens is they have elevated blood volume, at the same time much more constricted blood vessels, like perpetuating the elevated blood pressure that we see. Okay. So these two detrimental effects are further complicated if you have a dysfunctional RAS that remains activated even as blood pressure is increasing. And so at the end of the day, you have a complication or a combination of these multiple effects resulting in the persistence of the high blood pressure levels. Okay. And so this is just showing an event where you have the RAS not shutting off, because ideally in a healthy person, once the blood pressure levels come to optimal levels, it should shut off. But in salt-sensitive people or people with high blood pressure, this is not shut off. And so medication is often used as a way of trying to switch off the RAS, or some medications become ACE blockers, right? So the ACE helps with the conversion of the angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2, and that blocks that conversion so that it helps to regulate blood pressure a bit better. Okay. So the sodium content of many processed foods can be very high, and shown here examples of some popular fast foods that have sodium contents approaching or exceeding the AI in just a single portion. It's not very difficult to exceed recommended intakes when it comes to sodium, just because of our food system. With having a lot of foods all year round and trying to make foods shelf stable so we can have adequate supply of food, comes some of these detriments, right? Disadvantages, because we do have a lot of hidden sodium in food. Okay. So by looking at this, which of these foods do we think has the most sodium? There are a number of them. So the Big Mac, pepperoni pizza slice, whole grain carrot orange muffins, a small bowl of chili. Do I have the answers in the next slide? Yeah, I usually do. No? Yeah. Yes. Is it what? Is it the Big Mac? What do we think? Okay. So we do have the highest being the 1600, right? The pepperoni pizza slice. And that is closely followed by the Big Mac. So you were not far off, too far off. Oh no, actually the small bowl of chili before the Big Mac, right? So hopefully this is not chili that you've made at home, right? This is something you're buying from the store and, you know, maybe pre-packaged, ready to eat kind of. And then we have the Big Mac and then the others following as well. Okay. And so it's not very difficult. The point we're making here is not very difficult to exceed recommended intakes if just one portion is giving you 1,600. That's almost close to your 2,300 a day. Right. So here are examples of foods that are also high in potassium. And we know that this is protective. It's helpful in reducing blood pressure. And so while bananas are well known for being high in potassium, you can see that other foods can also contribute to potassium in the diet. So we can see 1% milk, reduced fat milk, beans being an important source, baked potatoes that come with the skin, it does help to retain some of. So potassium, very often if you look at nuts that are eaten with the skin, they do have higher levels of potassium because of the skin that is on. So maybe peanut butter, natural peanut butter that is ground with the skin on, they do have higher potassium levels than just peanuts. And I guess the worst in that order will be the one that has peanut butter and palm oil and everything mixed. I don't know what that brand is, Jiffy, maybe? There's a brand that's commonly peanut butter that kids like, yeah. So that one has a lot of other things mixed in there. Okay. So this is showing some of the potassium levels in the food. So one important way to lower sodium intake is to pay attention to the nutrition facts table where sodium and potassium are listed. And there's an example shown here of a low sodium spaghetti sauce. And in order for a food product to be labeled low in sodium, if you try to cast your mind back to when we talked about food labeling and health claims, the Canadian Food Regulation requires that it contains no more than 140 milligrams of sodium, as in the case here. It cannot have more than that. And so another health claim that is permitted on food that have no more than 140 milligrams of sodium, and at the same time they have at least 350 milligrams of potassium, can use this statement. So a healthy diet high in potassium and low in sodium reduces the risk of high blood pressure, which is true. And they can also add that high blood pressure is a risk factor for strokes and heart disease. Okay. So as we can see here on the NFT, the product contains 530 milligrams, which is higher than the 350 milligrams of potassium per serving in the guidelines. So it can qualify for this health claim. And the health claim we're talking about, again, just to state it again, is that a healthy diet high in potassium and low in sodium reduces the risk of high blood pressure, which is a risk factor for strokes and heart disease. Right? And so here again, if we look at sodium, it's lower than 140, and then the potassium is much more than 350. Okay. So the required reading for this section is about the DASH diet. So when we're looking at different types of diets, we mentioned the DASH eating plan. And the DASH plan stands for Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension. So this was a diet that was initially put together to help people with high blood pressure control their blood pressure levels, bring it down. So it is, you can think of it as an eating plan that contains many foods that are high in potassium, that are high in calcium and magnesium, because we talked about those two micronutrients also being helpful in regulating blood pressure. Okay. So the DASH plan also has low levels of sodium, and a lot of intervention trials have shown that the plan is very effective in reducing blood pressure. So as we go through this reading, it's important that we pay attention to whether we understand the results that are shown in the bar here, and whether we understand what is being shown as the effect of the DASH plan on blood pressure and the impact of combining it with reductions in sodium. So the control diet was a typical Western diet that is low in fiber and high in saturated fats. And the DASH diet was a diet that's high in fruits and vegetables, high in low-fat milk products, and generally high in potassium, calcium, magnesium, and fiber. Okay. So when we're doing this textbook reading, it also summarizes the results of RCTs and results that are coming from observational studies as well, so from cohort studies. And be sure you know what's are being measured in each type of study and how the results of the two types of study compare. So keep in mind that when we're looking at normal systolic blood pressure, we are looking at anything less than 120 milligrams of mercury. Okay? So 120. Okay. And be sure you can answer these questions shown here as you're reviewing this. Okay. So this graphic just compares the DASH diet to the Medi diet. So we talked about the Mediterranean diet as the most studied dietary pattern. And there's been a lot that has been published on it, and it always shows a positive effect on risk factors for cardiovascular disease and a lot of these chronic conditions. So what is the main difference that we see when we're looking at the DASH diet and the Mediterranean diet? And we've shown the Mediterranean diet in the past in class as well. What do we think the big difference is? Yes.
I mean, I don't know if this is exactly what you're referring to, but it does use servings instead of dietary patterns.
Okay. But then in looking at what type of foods are promoted, what would be the big difference between the two? Yes. Right. So in the DASH diet, there's a greater emphasis on dairy products, right? If you look at both of them, they're both really strong on increasing fruits and vegetable intake. They pretty much the same kind of foods are being promoted in both, but what is extra in the DASH diet will be the dairy products that is being recommended, because we know calcium and magnesium do support lowering blood pressure as well. So in this graphic, we see some Canadian hypertension statistics, and hypertension is measured by two numbers, okay? So we do have the systolic pressure over the diastolic pressure, okay? So the systolic blood pressure, which is the first and the higher number, measures pressure inside your arteries when your heart beats. And then we have the diastolic blood pressure, which is the second number, and it's typically the lower number, and it measures the pressure inside the artery when your heart rests between the beats, okay? And so typically 140, anything above 140 over 90 is considered high blood pressure. And ideally, one wants to keep it under 120/80, and that's considered normal, okay? So the graphic also indicates that hypertension tends to increase with age, and the graphic also indicates that individuals that are under 40 are less likely to be aware that they have hypertension. And it's unfortunate that because of our changing diets, now you can even find elevated blood pressures in school-age children. So they do not have full-blown hypertension, but their blood pressures are much higher than you would expect for their ages. So the graphic here shows some of the risk factors for hypertension, and we can see some of them shown here, such as overweight or being obese. The second one would be not eating enough fruits and vegetables. Third one, not getting enough exercise. And then another important risk factor for developing high blood pressure is having type 2 diabetes. Okay. So diabetes, which is elevated blood glucose, what it does is it damages the kidneys and the blood vessels. And then by doing that, it affects how blood vessels are constricting. It affects renin secretion from the kidney, or the sensitivity of kidney to drops, and increases in blood pressure as well. Okay. We also know that insulin resistance that happens in the case of diabetes also increases risk of high blood pressure as well. So the more of these risk factors that a person has, the greater the risk of developing high blood pressure. And that brings us to the end of our discussion on sodium and potassium. Any questions related to that before we move on to section 2? So please make sure you go through the assigned reading and you are able to answer the questions on the left that we showed on the previous slide. So at this point, we can take a quick break and we can be back at 2 to do section 2. It's 1:52 now. Yeah, hi.
We got a grade back for the cricket, right? Okay, is that
To grade.
okay? When is that coming out?
This is coming out when the feedback stage ends.
Okay. Okay, I see.
Yeah. So once that Okay, so I think we can get started again, looking at section 2. So what we just did for the first part is to see some major minerals, sodium, potassium, and their role in blood pressure. We want to move on in section 2 to talk about some major minerals, calcium. We spend a lot of time talking about calcium, then we'll look at phosphorus and magnesium, and some information on bone health. So as we do know, calcium is essential to the structure of bones, and calcium levels in the blood must be maintained in a very narrow range in order for muscles to function. And so heart muscles included, if we want heart muscles to function properly, that range of blood levels of calcium has to be maintained. So calcium has a very tightly controlled blood level. And as we saw in our earlier discussion when we're looking at fat-soluble vitamins, specifically vitamin D's function is to help regulate and maintain normal blood calcium levels. So when calcium levels drop, it must be taken from the bone. And this can result in the weakening of the bone structure if how much calcium you're getting from your dietary intake is not optimal. And so over a lifetime, when you have suboptimal levels of calcium coming from your diet, that could contribute to a higher risk of osteoporosis later on. So we've seen this before, this diagram before when we're looking at vitamin D. And as we discussed the synthesis of the calcium transport protein, vitamin D is important to synthesize that protein. And this protein in turn helps with absorption of calcium into the blood. So we talked about how vitamin D acts as a ligand. It comes together to form a protein vitamin complex that now is the transcription factor that produces or expresses the calcium transport protein. And this is what helps with absorption of calcium. So the absorption of calcium actually varies through the life cycle, and newborn infants absorb calcium from breast milk and use it to build bone. And absorption, when we look at the absorption levels from breast milk or from infant formula, it is very high at about 60%. For adults, however, when we consume calcium-rich foods, we typically absorb on average about 25 to 30% of this calcium from our food. So if intakes of vitamin D happens to be inadequate in adults, then the absorption can actually drop even up to 10% because you do not have enough calcium binding protein to help with this absorption. So as shown here, the RDA takes into account the absorption rate. For example, if the body needs to absorb 300 milligrams per day to meet its needs, then the RDA will be set at about 1,000 milligrams. And that is just to account for the fact that only 30% of it will end up being absorbed into the body. Okay. So we've talked about childhood or maybe infancy from absorption from breast milk. We talk about adults. Next, the life stage that we're looking at is during pregnancy. And so during pregnancy, interestingly enough, calcium absorption increases. And so you have about 57% absorption of calcium from the body from our foods in the second trimester, and it goes as high as about 75% in the third trimester if you have optimal levels of calcium intake, right? So the RDA for calcium during pregnancy remains unchanged, despite the fact that or in spite of the fact that a pregnant woman needs more calcium to support the development of the fetal bone. And that value is not changed because the body is able to absorb much more in the second trimester and even much more in the third trimester to make sure that the infant has enough calcium to support normal growth. So note that the bioavailability of calcium, it can also be decreased by what you have in your food. and these are often referred to as antinutritive factors. And examples of these include tannins. They can decrease how much calcium is absorbed, and not just calcium, but mainly a lot of minerals. So iron, they all can be impaired by the presence of tannins, phytates, and oxalates, right? And so vegetables that are low in oxalate are especially good sources of calcium, and you can see some of them listed here, okay? So we can see kale, collard greens, turnip greens. These are all good sources of calcium from plants. So we can see spinach is not listed here. Although spinach has considerably high amounts of calcium, it also has high levels of oxalates, and so it makes it difficult to absorb the calcium from them. So this is a graphic that illustrates the relationship between vitamin D and calcium, and it shows how when calcium levels are low, you can have stimulation of the parathyroid hormone and vitamin D, and then normal blood calcium levels are restored by increasing calcium reabsorption by the kidney. And so normal calcium levels too can be restored as a result of increasing calcium absorption from the small intestine as well. And then if much more calcium is needed, you will have release of calcium from the bone, and this is what we call bone resorption. Okay. So as we can see here, you do not need to know the function of the parathyroid and calcitonin hormones. What is most important to remember from here is how resorption can help maintain blood calcium levels, how calcium reabsorption by the kidneys also contributes to that effect, and how there can be increased calcium absorption in the digestive system as a way of maintaining calcium levels. Okay. So one of the commonly known functions of calcium is related to bone health, right? But there are also many non-bone related functions of calcium. So as I mentioned briefly before, calcium functions in muscle contraction and neurotransmitter release. It also helps regulate blood clotting and helps regulate blood pressure as well. There have been observational studies that have also found an association between increased calcium intake and decreased risk of colon cancer. Okay. So one hypothesis for this relationship is that calcium is able to bind with toxins in the colon, and then it makes them insoluble and biologically inactive. And so by doing that, it's able to prevent colon cancer, essentially preventing the colon lining from being exposed to these toxins because it makes them biologically inactive. So the most important function of calcium is related to bone health. And bone mineral is made up of a compound called hydroxyapatite. And so you can see, I don't know if any of us have seen this commercial on social media about a gum that can restore your hydroxyapatite. No? Oh, okay. So I guess I'm the only one who got that. The most important function of calcium is related to bone health. And I'm not sure if that's true or not, but apparently the gum can help restore your hydroxyapatite and contribute to it and restore your teeth if it's in bad shape. So bone mineral is made up of a compound called hydroxyapatite, and as you can see by the formula that's shown here, we can see that calcium is key to the inorganic bone mineral matrix. And so this compound is able to give strength and is also able to give rigidity to bone. The organic matrix of bone is made up of largely the protein collagen. So the hydroxyapatite will be the inorganic structure, and then the organic part will be collagen. So while the mineral component of bone gives it strength and rigidity, you have the protein component giving it some flexibility. So the figure here shows that there are two types of bone. We have cortical bone, which is quite compact, And then we have the trabecular bone or the spongy bone, which is the metabolically active part of it. And so this will be the metabolically active part, and this is the compact part of the bone. Okay. And so essentially during osteoporosis, it is the metabolically active part that is eroded, right? You lose that part during osteoporosis. Right? So there's a case study on someone called Margie, and it's a case study in our textbook, part of the textbook readings, that we will talk about in a few minutes. And so if you have any questions related to flexibility of the bone and the organic part, the inorganic part, please keep it till we finish reviewing the case study, because it makes things a bit more clearer. Okay. So here we see how bone remodeling happens. And this graphic shows key features of bone metabolism. So in response to stress put on our bone during normal active living, you will have bones undergoing formation and breakdown. And the breakdown is what we call bone resorption, okay? So for example, here we see active bone formation taking place. And this is a result of the activity of cells in the bone called osteoblasts. So we have osteoblasts with a B and osteoclasts, one with a C. Okay. So bone can also be broken down, a process called bone resorption, and that's a result of action of bone cells called osteoclasts with a C, okay, which consume bone by secreting acids to the bone. And by the activity of these osteoblasts, which build the bone, and the osteoclast, which helps with bone resorption, it's able to remodel the bone to optimal shapes and optimal strength to support growth, right? So I do have a little memory aid for distinguishing between the two cells. So osteoblast with a B helps me to remember build, right? So B for build bone. While osteoclast with a C, I like to think of it as consuming bone, right? So hopefully that's helpful, but if not, I'm sure we can all come up with our own mnemonic to help us remember. So we've mentioned osteoporosis, and specifically this is a disease where protein or the organic matrix and the inorganic matrix of the bone called, which is the hydroxyapatite, they are both lost. So the definition of osteoporosis is based on the degree of bone loss as shown in this table. And so we can see some of these definitions shown here. So this is a more general definition. But then we do have osteopenia. So at this point, you haven't reached osteoporosis yet. And that is anywhere between -1 and -2.5 standard deviations, right? Below what is considered normal, okay? So here we have -1 standard deviation or above, that will be considered normal bone density. And once you are below -2.5 standard deviations, then that is seen as you moving into osteoporosis. And that's where there's higher risk of bone fracture and some of these complications related to bone loss. Okay. So bones progress from a normal bone density to a low bone density. And at that point, as I said, we will call that osteopenia. And then when you have a more severe condition where you've typically lost all the metabolically active part of the bone, we will refer to that as osteoporosis. So the loss of bone is shown here, and the loss of bone in the sample on the left is clearly evident, where you see some of the gaps in there, right? Compared to a healthy bone that we see on the right that has the hydroxyapatite structure clearly in place. So this is the case study I was referring to. It is in your textbook reading, recommended textbook reading. So Margie is a 75-year-old, and she felt a searing pain in her hip when her foot struck the pavement, and the next thing she knew, she was lying in the street. So I think the story is about her taking a walk, and then as she tried to step up on the pavement, that's when she had the pain happening. And the pain was as a result of having a fracture. Okay. And so let us go to the case study attached under week 12. I think I have it attached under week 12. Can we see it attached? Is it attached under week 12? Or maybe you can see it on your textbook, in your textbook. So as we go through the case study, we're hoping that by the end we'll be able to answer some of the questions as we go through the subsequent slides, such as what is the role of calcium in maintaining healthy bones? Why is it of concern that Margie's vitamin D is low? Did her early menopause affect her bone health? There are also questions about estrogen and other things. So if we can pull up the case study, that will be really good, so we can review it together. What page is it? I don't have it on my slide. I had it attached as an attachment, if you can see it, as a link. Yes? Yes. It's in week 11? Oh, I posted it earlier. Okay, great. So if we can go to week 11 and thank you for pointing that out. If we can take a look at that. And with these questions in mind, as we go through the next couple of slides, so I'll let everyone read it, just take a minute for everyone to read it. As we go through the next couple of slides, we will be finding answers to what was happening to Is it Margie or Margie? I think she's not here. She will not mind. So maybe I'll give just 2 more minutes for us to read the case study. Let's see. Okay, so we'll come back to slide 35 as we go on and try to understand what might be happening with bone loss and how osteoporosis is developing. So these are bone scans that are produced by a special X-ray method called the DEXA. We may have heard about DEXA, dual energy X-ray absorptiometry. And the scan on the left is that of a 24-year-old athlete, and the one on the right is that of Margie, our 75-year-old in the case study. And as you can see, the sharp contrast in the amount of bone mineral present, right? So we can see that definitely the 24-year-old has much denser bones than what we see for Margie. So in addition to the hip, the spine can also be affected by osteoporosis, right? Where you have, the hydroxyapatite levels going down, and also the metabolically active part wearing off. Okay. So the vertebrae of the spine is made up of the compact bone on one side, and then we also have the trabecular part of the spine as well. Okay. And that part is more readily affected by osteoporosis as well. So the trabecular bone essentially will collapse, and that is what produces the curvature of the spine as shown when someone develops osteoporosis. So there are several consequences of this curvature of the spine, such as the loss of height, which is shown here, and also the curved spine can also compress internal organs, especially the lungs, and this increases the risk for respiratory infections when has osteoporosis that happens in the spine as well. So there are several risk factors for osteoporosis, and some of which one can modify and others you cannot. So you can see some of the unmodifiable risk factors of osteoporosis at the top of the table, and some of the ones that one can modify, such as smoking, which weakens bones. Another one that can be modified is physical activity levels, such as exercise, which strengthens the bones and promotes the uptake of minerals. We have alcohol, which interferes with absorption of calcium, increasing risk for osteoporosis. And then essentially diets that are low in calcium and vitamin D can contribute to bone loss over a lifetime. Also, these dietary intake is modifiable, and so changes can be made with that. With regards to the ones that cannot be modified, those are shown up here as well. Especially one I wanted to point out is family history. So having a family member with osteoporosis also increases one's risk for it as well. Okay. So this graph shows what happens to bone mass over a lifetime. And here we can see age indicated on the x-axis, and on y, or the horizontal axis, we see bone mass. So very early in childhood and through adolescence and early adulthood, both men and women take up, and they do accumulate calcium from the diet. And this is a process called accretion. Right? So as you see here, both men and women tend to follow the same path in early adulthood, although men typically will have bigger bones and generally will have much higher bone mass. So the peak bone mass occurs in young adulthood, and as one progresses to middle and late adulthood, a certain amount of bone mass loss happens inevitably, right, as one ages. Men and women, however, they do differ in the rates of this bone loss that is happening. And as we can see with males, there is a gradual decline in bone mass. However, women, on the other hand, at about age 50, as a result of menopause, they do suffer a more dramatic loss in bone mass. And you can see this by the changing slope of the line. And so we can see males shown here as well. So initially, looks pretty much the same to about early adulthood. And then we can see a difference. We talk about the inevitable decline that's going to happen regardless of sex. However, for women, we see, a faster rate of decline in bone mass after 50, and that's typically as a result of menopause happening. Okay. So what is happening here? One important thing to remember is that bones love estrogen, right? Because estrogen stimulates osteoblast activity. Osteoblasts are the builders, osteoblast activity, which, if you recall, is important for building bones, stronger bones. Okay. So men do make some estrogen from testosterone, and testosterone levels decline gradually with age in men. Estrogen in females is produced by the ovaries, and these ovaries cease to function at about age 50. So for several years after menopause, the absence of estrogen is what is responsible for the dramatic decline in bone mass, although this does eventually stabilize. Okay. So the combination of the fact that women have smaller bones to start with, and then they have less bone mass to begin with, and also suffering from a dramatic decline in estrogen in their middle adulthood years, makes them more vulnerable to osteoporosis. So one thing to remember is that bones love estrogen. And so when you have optimal levels of estrogen, it helps with osteoblast activity, building bone, and then having denser, strong bones. Okay. So metabolically, what is happening with age-related bone loss in the elderly life stage is that osteoclast activity now is exceeding osteoblast activity, right? So osteoclasts are the ones that are breaking down the bone, responsible for resorption, right? And that now is exceeding the activity of osteoblasts, and that is why we see a decline as one ages. So keep in mind that a certain amount of age-related bone loss will happen regardless, right? It's inevitable. But you don't want to lose so much bone so that, like Margie, your bones break when they're exposed to only very minor stresses, right? Like just stepping off a curb, right? Or stepping off a pavement. What happened with Margie is that she crossed what's called the fracture threshold. And what is the fracture threshold? So the fracture threshold is shown here. So we've seen this graph initially where there's that decline and a very fast decline even after age 50 for women. Okay. So the fracture threshold is the level of bone mass that is so low that there's a high probability of bone fracture. So here we see two individuals in this graph, and they're typically following similar rates of bone loss, but because one of them started at a higher peak bone mass, they do not cross the fracture threshold in their lifetime. But the individuals shown in purple, with the purple line, they start off with a lower peak bone mass. Such will be the case for Margie's case. And so within their lifetime, they do cross the fracture threshold. So to reduce the risk of osteoporosis, one has to consume an adequate amount of vitamin D and calcium to ensure the development of peak bone mass in life as early as possible. And that is why physical activity is especially encouraged in adolescence, so that during that period, from adolescence all the way to early adulthood, even up to your 30s, that you are building peak bone mass during that period, so that the likelihood of you losing bone mass to a point where you reach your fracture threshold is very minimal. And that's why there is that recommendation to build enough. And it comes from not just a diet that is high in vitamin D and calcium, but a physically active life as well to help build these. And so another way as well to reduce the risk of osteoporosis is, in addition to calcium and vitamin D intake over a lifetime, is to engage in weight-bearing exercises, because that is what it helps to build the dense bones. Okay. And these exercises are known to change the slope of the lines and reduce how fast bone is being lost as well. Okay. So many people underestimate the consequences of osteoporosis, or specifically bone fractures that result from osteoporosis. They often do occur in the elderly ages, And typically women in their 80s or older, it can be common. And it's a very, very difficult event to recover from. And very often, unfortunately, has, very high risk of fatality linked to this. And so in order to understand osteoporosis in Canada, a study called the CAMOS was conducted, and it looked at statistics related to bone fracture. They did find out that individuals who suffer bone fracture, they are about 3 to 4 times more likely to die within a year of that bone fractures in the elderly ages. So this, we're talking about 80 plus, right? Compared to individuals who did not break a bone. And one of the reasons this may occur is because breaking a bone usually results in some degree of immobility, and this can cause pneumonia. It can increase one's risk for pneumonia and death as well. There's also a loss of muscle mass and the added stress that bone fracture places on individuals who may already be in poor health and on several medications during that time as well. So this can have really serious consequences. So what are we saying? What we're saying is that when one is young, the best way to prevent osteoporosis later in life is to ensure that you are getting adequate amounts of calcium and vitamin D. And it is really concerning that you do find that it's in adolescence that the consumption of milk goes down, right? But that would actually be an ideal time to build, bone mass as well. Okay. In addition to having a diet that is high in calcium and vitamin D, one has to also engage in weight-bearing exercise or just exercise generally, because the stress on the bones stimulate bone formation. So the picture here shows some of the foods that are available that are good sources of calcium, such as milk, other dairy products, green leafy vegetables, beans, and also some types of canned fishes as well. So canned salmon is a good source of calcium because it contains fish bones. You can think of some other fish types such as sardines that are usually prepared and eaten with the bones as well. Okay. Also shown here, we can see calcium, we can see vitamin D, fortified orange juice. These are all good sources of calcium. Fortified soy beverages with calcium fortified soy beverages also contain the same amount of calcium as cow's milk. Okay. There are other milk products that are made for those who do not consume cow's milk. Other milk products made from rice and nuts that may also be fortified with calcium as well. But it's important to take a look at the NFT to make sure that the calcium levels they are contributing are comparable. Okay. So what we want to do next is to take a look at this resource, and I do have the link, I think this time in week 12. It's just a short in-class reading about phosphorus, and then we will discuss phosphorus as a group. Phosphorus is also a very important element in the development of bone. It forms part of that structure of the hydroxyapatite crystal. Deficiencies are very rare, and so we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about it. It's not a nutrient of concern in our part of the world. And food sources include animal source foods, dairy, meats, plants, legumes. So if we can go to I think it's week 12, we can see a link that takes us to a reading with regards to phosphorus, and then we can try and answer some questions about its food sources. And what the deficiency symptoms look like. Did I get it into week 12 this time? Yeah, okay. maybe 3 more minutes, and then we come back together and answer a few questions on phosphorus, and then we do our crossword. So maybe a minute more, and then we can talk about some of the things that we are learning about phosphorus on that page. Okay, so what did we learn about phosphorus? Maybe we start off with some important food sources. Yes, go ahead. Okay, so seafood, red meat, poultry, any others? Any plant sources? Yes. Okay. So what are some of its functions in the body? If we found any of those. Maybe one function? Yes. Say that again. It keeps blood pH. Okay. ATPs maybe? Adenosine triphosphate. Phosphorus plays a role there. Any others? We talked about how it's part of the structure of the hydroxyapatite, and a lot of other roles, like pervasive roles throughout the body. Okay. And then how about deficiency? Is there anything about its deficiency? No? Talks about the deficiency being rare, right? However, severe deficiency can contribute to kidney disease as well. Okay. So last but not the least, micronutrient we are looking here, this is a major mineral. is magnesium. Magnesium is another element that is also important for the development of bone, as it is a part of the inorganic matrix of bone. So, although not part of the hydroxyapatite itself, it's needed for vitamin D to function properly. So here you can see some of the food sources of magnesium shown on this slide, and you can see that they all tend to be plant-based products such as seeds and nuts, as well as fruits, vegetables, and whole grains. Okay. So this brings us to the end of the slideshow. I wanted us to, so we can vote on this. Either go through the crossword together, or I'm going to add more practice questions for tomorrow for your own review. Would you like us to go through the crossword together? Or you would like to leave early? All in favor of leaving early? And those in favor of let's do the crossword? Okay, so I have just two people saying let's do the crossword. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the answer key for the crossword on Kirkus. Please note that tomorrow there's no in-person class, so I will be putting a lot of practice questions. And the hope is that you use the class hour to complete that and make sure you understand the responses for the crossword as well. Okay. Please review the assigned reading. That's important as well, please. Yeah.
On my quiz, the numbers quiz, it says late. Okay, I submitted it on time, but I resubmitted.
The nutrition numbers quiz. Yeah.
I resubmitted it on a different date. Okay, I'll show you right now. So, attempt 1. Okay. January 25th. Okay, and then if you go back one, it says late because I did a second attempt.
But why did you do a second one?
I thought I did good because there was no break.
Okay, so these are things that I can address if you